My name is Betty Robertson Woodward. I was born and raised in Prineville, Oregon in 1943. My grandfather come from the Lamonta country over in the Grizzly area when he was just a young boy, and I do not remember where exactly he was born. My grandmother his grandpa's name was Alonzo Smith, and my grandmother, her name was Sylvia Moore Smith. And when she was 6 years old, she was born in Walterville, Oregon, which is on the east side of the mountains. Her family decided to move over to the Lamonta country. So at 6 years old, they loaded stuff in a wagon, and they had cattle, a few cattle that they were trailing, and they started across the mountains between Eugene and Sisters. And on that drive, they got into, Grandma woke up one morning and everybody was just happy and jolly and singing and carrying on, and she couldn't figure out what they were all wound up about. So she rolled over and she raised up the flap on the wagon, and there was about 6 inches of snow on the ground. And they had been having a lot of trouble trying to get the cattle to come over the lava fields. It was cutting their hooves and stuff, and they were getting sore-footed, and they didn't know for sure what they were going to do to get them on over the hump. And with the snow being on the ground that morning that had happened overnight, they were able to come on and got out of the lava fields that day, and then they come on through Sisters and down to Redmond and over to where they went up into the Grizzly area. My grandfather had 11 brothers and sisters. And with that, when they got there, Grandpa was just a young boy, and they had decided their occupation was going to be in the timber industry. They had cattle, and there were 7 boys and 4 girls. And so they had a lot of help with all the boys in the family. And so Grandpa and Uncle Tom and Fergie Smith, and I can't think the one that was just below him, were all fairly close to the same age. Work-wise, they all worked together, and they decided they were going to build a mill. So they started building a mill. They hauled lumber, I think from Madras, by team and horses, and hauled the lumber up there and built the mills. Had a big sawmill that they started. And about that time, Grandma and her family, the Moore family, showed up, and they were neighbors to them, pretty close neighbors to them up there on the hill. And I can't remember what her parents' names were, but she had, there were 8 kids in that family, and I think there were 4 girls and 4 boys, I think. There was Uncle Ernie, Uncle Ray, Uncle Clyde, I can't think of the other boys' names. But there were 4 girls, and there was Goldie and Grandma and Pearl, and Ruby. That's 4 of them. And they all lived up in the Grizzly area for quite some time. My mother and my aunt, the oldest child in Grandma and Grandpa's family, were both born up there at Grizzly. And then they had that mill going pretty good. The first mill, I think, caught fire and burnt down. And they just immediately went right back to work and built another mill and got it going, and they had lumber going every which direction. And some of it went to the Willamette Valley, some of it went to Central Oregon, and a lot of time spent with those boys in the timber industry with all the work that had to be done there at the mill. And in had to be the late 1920s, early 30s, Grandpa moved his mill up Mill Creek. Or I shouldn't say moved it. He built a mill up Mill Creek. And so he was up close to the Ochoco National Forest at that time. Well, along about that period of time, the Forest Service allotted the timber contracts, and my grandpa Alonzo got the first timber contract that was ever allotted in the Ochoco National Forest. And while they were had the mill there up Mill Creek, they were starting to put in the Ochoco Reservoir. Well, they were working on the fill of the Ochoco Reservoir, and Grandpa cut all the timber that went into the fill of the Ochoco Dam when it was built. So that was another kind of a momentous thing that he did while he was being a timberman. He loved the timber. And Mother always said, as kids, and they had 5 girls up there in that area, and she said as being involved in the timber, they just had so much fun because they could go out and ride through the timber with their horses. And as young girls, Mother and Auntie Hazel would ride to Summit Prairie and help Mrs. Breese cook for the hay crew when they were haying at Summit Prairie. And so then Grandpa moved. He needed to be a little closer to water than he was, so he moved the Mill Creek Mill down right there below Ochoco's, going towards the ranger station, and set up his mill there, and cut timber for everybody in the whole country. And Mother said when she was about, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, somewhere along in there, she said Grandpa come in, and it was in the wintertime because there was snow on the ground. And he come in the house one Sunday morning, and he said to my grandmother, he said, he always called her Siv. Her name was Sylvia, and he called her Siv. And he said, Siv, he said, I got to start the mill up today. And Grandma said, oh, did somebody come by and want to buy some lumber? And Mom said he just had the strangest look on his face. And he stood there for quite a while, and he finally got his wits about him so he could talk. And he said, the big young family that lived about 2 miles from him up Ochoco there had 13 children. And their house caught on fire that night and burnt totally to the ground. They got all the kids out, but they lost everything. And Grandpa looked at her and he said, I've got to start that mill, because he said, I got to cut some lumber. I got to build them a house. So after he got through with breakfast, he got his warm clothes on, and the girls got warm clothes on and went out, helping him get his mill started and going. And he started cutting timber, and he'd cut till he'd have a wagon full, and he'd pull a wagon over there, and all the neighbors pitched in and would help him start building it. And he started with the shell on the outside. Had to be a 2-story house because they had so many kids. And so he had the idea in his head how he was going to build it. And with a pencil and a piece of paper, he kind of drew it out for him and showed him, this is what it needs to be, and it's got to be this big, and the upstairs got to be this big. And he ended up and built that whole house out of all the lumber that he had cut. Somebody had an big old stove, one of those big old tall barrel stoves, and they brought that down and to give that to them because they had a new stove at their home and they didn't need that one. So when they got the outside part of it and the roof part of it on, then it was closed up enough they could start that stove up with a lot of the scrap and stuff that they'd cut and have it warm in there. And he did all the upstairs, all the beds, made bunk beds, a couple of full beds for the boys upstairs. They had 4 bedrooms downstairs, and the girls each had a twin bed, and Grandpa and Grandma Young had the full bed. And then he went in and he built all the kitchen cupboards with doors, and then he built the counters, the cabinets underneath, and all the cupboard where she could stand there and whittle vegetables and stuff, getting supper ready and what. And put all the cupboards in, all the doors in, built a huge, great big long table that all 13 of them could sit down at the same table and eat, with benches. And he got it all put together, and of course the neighbors brought in stuff that they had, extra stuff that they had that they'd share with them. And really they lost a lot of stuff, but boy, everybody had a lot of stuff that Mom said that it was like Christmas. Everybody kept bringing stuff to them that they had that they could spare. And so one day after this was all done and they got moved into the house and everything worked, the lights worked and everything worked, and the electricity would work, and here it was a Saturday or Sunday. Here come Mr. and Mrs. Young over, and they knocked on the door. Grandma and Grandpa just thought they were coming to visit, and so they come in, sat down, and just like they, was a day that they just wanted to come over and visit with them, and they sat there for a while, visited. Finally, Mr. Young got up and he put his hand out to Grandpa and he said, "Lon," he said, "I got to tell you, I want to know how much this house cost." Grandpa sat there for a little while. He looked down at his shoes. Mom said, I didn't know whether he was going to answer him or not. And he finally looked up and he said, I can't remember what Mr. Young's first name was, but he said, he said, "I'll tell you right now." He said, "That bill's been paid in full." And Mr. Young said, No, that's not how this is going to go. And Grandpa said, "Yeah, that's how it's going to go, because God and I are the one that paid that bill." And Mom said, Mrs. Young sat there and just cried and cried and cried. She said, "You are the best people we've ever met, and we thank you." And Grandpa looked up and he said, "Well, you got to thank that man upstairs. He's the one that put this all together." And that's the grandparents that I come out of. And my grandmother, I always said, and I'll still say to this day, that woman was the most blessed woman God ever put breath in. So that's kind of my young bringing up in Prineville as my grandparents. And they ended up and sold the mill up there below Ochoco and bought the property that lays out here on Lamonta Road from the end of the hill where you come up from Harwood and across the train tracks, and the pond up there at Hudspeth, the shell surface dirt and stuff was kind of the end of that. Our property started there. Grandma's property started there, and it went all the way down to the Butcher Boys' driveway. The Butcher Boys that are up on the hill that have the butcher plant. She owned all that front footage out there. That was all Grandpa and Grandma's, and that was all alfalfa fields. There used to be a big barn set up on top of the hill, and gosh, us kids played hours in that barn. If we didn't play hide and go seek, we'd string up a rope and put a piece of wood down through it where you could sit on it and swing back and forth across that barn until Uncle Jim would come up there and be mad at us because we were going to tear the barn down if we didn't quit doing that, and he'd make us stop. But we had so much fun out there at the ranch, and I spent every waking hour that I could with my grandmother, and I just lived down, hop, skip, and a jump down the field from her. But when I got big enough that I could get up there, I could just walk along the ditch bank and I'd be at Grandma's house. Mom never had to worry that I was lost because she always knew that that's where I'd be. The first time I did it, she'd gone outside to change the sprinkler, and I went outside with her. But she was taking a little bit longer than what she thought. Well, I got to where I knew where the path was along that canal, and I took off, and down the canal I went. And Mother, and this was right after Auntie Hazel, her sister, had lost their son in an irrigation ditch. And it was about probably, I think, 8 months or there since Ronald had died, and she just knew that I had fell in that canal and I was gone. And she just panicked. Finally, she got to looking, and she looked up towards Grandma's, and here stood Grandma on the bridge with her arm around me and her apron in her hand, and she's waving her apron like this. So Mom knew that she had me. So she gets in the car and she backs out and drives up the driveway. She said, I had full intentions of giving you a darn good spanking when I got up there. But she said, when I got there, I realized I would have had to spank Grandma first. So she said, you didn't get a spanking because Grandma would not allow me to spank you. So my grandmother was a dear to me. In 1940, I think it was 40, and it could be 41, Grandpa, and I don't know the real extent of this whole accident or where they were at for sure. I think they were down, I think they were working for Prime Products, and I was going to say I think they were down there at Prime Products, but I think they were out wherever they were logging at right then. But his brother backed over him in a logging truck, and it killed him. And at that time, Grandma still had 6 kids at home. They had 8 kids altogether, but there were still 6 of them home. So, pretty tragic deal. Grandma and Grandpa were just cemented together like forever friends you could ever imagine. and she took it really hard. My dad spent night after night going up there and making sure that she didn't take off down the lane, because a couple of times she took off and she was headed for the cemetery. And he'd stopped her and got her loaded back in the car and got her back home. But Uncle Jim was just starting to walk, so he was just a baby. And pretty tough time for the whole family at that time. But they had 3 boys, and Dad stepped up to the plate and made sure that those boys, well, he just did everything a dad would do for boys that were almost in high school, about 9, 10, 11 years old. And he took them fishing, he took them hunting, he taught them how to do chores and stuff that they hadn't really picked up on to do. And Grandma always said, she said, I just don't know what I'd have done if your daddy hadn't stepped up to help me, because she said he was just a godsend to take Grandpa's place. So I never knew my grandpa, and none of us kids, the only one that would have had got to seen him, but he was so small, was the little boy that drowned of Auntie Hazel's. And he was the oldest grandchild. And, but, after, and then he drowned, so he wasn't around to talk about Grandpa. My brother Jerry would have loved to have been able to spend time with my grandpa. And so that made my brother Jerry Robertson and my cousin Denny Denton, which was Auntie Hazel's oldest boy, and myself and Auntie Hazel's girl that was just 6 weeks younger than I was. That was the 4 grandkids for a long, long time before any of the rest of them started having any grandkids. So we were the 4 musketeers. And Jerry and I would just go and stay at Grandma's at will. Just any time we could go, we were at her house. Shirley she'd come and play with me all day up there at Grandma's, but when it got dark, she would cry till her dad would come get her. So those kids never stayed with us much at Grandma's. So we really got the benefits of knowing my grandmother and what a wonderful lady she really was. And she lived there, can't remember what year it was. She was the 1970 Pioneer Queen for the Pioneer Association. And I got to crown her, being I was the oldest granddaughter, which that was a real honor for me. And she had kept boarders and roomers, kids that lived like out at Paulina that wanted to maybe play sports, and the drive was too far. And so she just opened up her home and always had a bed for somebody, and so they'd come and stay with her. So she got to taking in boarders and roomers. Well, then she decided she would sell the ranch and move to town, which we were all shocked at that. But when we found out what house she was buying in town, then we all changed our tune, because she bought the Baldwin house on First Street that sits across the street from the Elks Club, the big white house that sat there. And we always laughed at her. She didn't really want to be Pioneer Queen because she thought she didn't deserve that. Well, of course, all our family knew she did, and we were pretty forceful that that's what she needed to do. So she didn't ever drive, so I was driving school bus, And I would stop every morning to see if she needed to go to the grocery store or the bank or whatever she needed to do. I was at her will. Everybody else was working, and I was the one that had the time between bus drive, morning bus drive and afternoon bus drive, that I could go do it with her. So one morning, well, I'm taking it back. I need to go back. We had a big dinner. She had eventually, that home became a big place. She had 9 boarders and roomers in that house. She did all the washing, all the cooking, all the cleaning, all by herself. And that was quite a job. And she wasn't a very big lady. But she had the heart of gold, and she loved it. And we'd have the most wonderful holidays and dinners you could ever imagine in that house with her. And as a kid growing up in Prineville, all through the years, I'd go to town with her on a Saturday. She always needed to go to town. Never needed a lot of groceries, because she had a garden, and she had beef and pigs and chickens and all that stuff. But occasionally she needed some salt or some sugar and that kind of stuff, so she needed to go to town on Saturday. But it was kind of a social event every time we went to town on Saturday. It would take, if you went to town at 10 o'clock, you're lucky if you got home at 5:30. Because everywhere she went, she knew everybody. She'd start out at the grocery store. We'd go across the street, and she would go to Erickson's department store. Mainly because she wanted to go in there and make sure. That's when Gary Romine's dad, Rusty, was the manager of it. So she had to go in there and visit with Rusty a little bit. And occasionally Ramona would be working in the ladies section, so she'd go in there and visit with her niece Ramona. And always had to go through the material, because she loved making aprons and pillowcases and whatever else she thought she could make with her treadle sewing machine. And they might have something new since she was in town last week, and she didn't want to miss it. So that's how we'd begin. Then we get to Erickson's department store, and then you went on up the street, and on the corner was Bank Drug, and you went in there and visited with them and kind of checked out the drugstore. Around the corner, you had to go into the menswear, because Eddie Lane was in there, and Marie, and she had to visit with them. And next door across the alley was Judy, I can't think what their last name was. She had a dress shop. So she'd go in and she'd thumb through the dresses and see if there was anything there that kind of wet her whistle, and maybe a new dress to wear to church. And the next place was Dick Lamert's dime store, and that's where the gym is now that the girls have. And she could spend hours in there visiting with them. Just loved that. And then occasionally she'd cross the street, and we'd have to go into the hardware store there on the corner by the theater. Come past the theater, and there was a big hardware store there that took in half the block, and she would go, maybe she needed some nails, and maybe she needed a screw or two or something like that she was missing, and she'd pick that up. And come on up the street, and it was the Bowman, and that's before the museum got stretched as far as it did. and she'd come across the street going north was the big drugstore that I'll think of his name here in a minute. Anyway, a huge, great big drugstore there, and both of those drugstores, the bank drug and the drugstore catty corner from it, had a soda fountain in it. So occasionally we had to stop and have something to drink, or we'd buy an ice cream cone, which, as me tagging along with her, was just a great treat. Follow Grandma, because she always had. And when we'd get to the bakery, we always had to buy sugar cookies about this big. 24 of them at least. And occasionally she'd whip up. She was the best cook in the whole world, baking and meat and all that kind of stuff. She was a good one. But she would make cookies. Well, Uncle Bob was working up at Alexander Yawkey, up on top of the hill where Coin Mill was, or ended up to be. And I'd stand there in the kitchen watching her make his lunch, and she'd always put a sack, and you didn't have the Ziploc sack, she just had the kind of the paper, cloudy paper, little sacks, and she'd put 3 or 4 cookies in there for him, for, you know, if he just had time to have a cookie, why he could stop and get that out of his lunch. Well, he come home one day and he said, "Mom, did you put cookies in my lunch today?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "I didn't have any cookies in my lunch." Well, she said, "Bob, you know I put cookies in your lunch every day." Well, he said, "I know you do, but I didn't have cookies today." And she was a-bustling around the kitchen, and I was sitting on a chair in the dining room, and I was watching her. And she was kind of fuzzed up about that and just kind of flustered to think something happened to the cookies out of his lunch pail. So after she got through with supper, she got out her mixer, and she got out the flour and the sugar and the whole 9 yards. And I said, what are you making, Grandma?" "Well, I got to make some cookies for Bob to take in his lunch." And I said, "Are you going to send cookies today, being somebody took the cookies you think somebody took the cookies yesterday?" Well, she said, "Yeah, that's the only answer I got." Coming from my grandmother, who was the most staunch Christian lady you could ever ask for, this just floored me to death. She gets the mixer going, and she gets to making all this chocolate chip cookie deal. For her chocolate, she used X-Lax. And she told Bob what she did. And she said, "Don't you eat one of those cookies." Or she said, "You're going to be in the same shape of whoever's stealing your cookies." So he thought that was so funny, and he laughed just like the rest of us did. We couldn't imagine Grandma doing something like that. But anyway, he left that morning with his lunch pail, and I was helping her do her dishes. And when I was standing there drying dishes, I said to Grandma, I said, "Well, I wonder if the culprit's got into Uncle Bob's lunch pail yet." She said, "Well, I don't know, but it'll soon show up." Well, he didn't get home till like 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We just couldn't wait for him to walk in the door. And he come in, and he's just a-swinging his lunch pail, coming across she had a screened-in front porch. He's just a-swinging his lunch pail. And he opened the door, and Grandma's standing right there, and he just had a big smile on his face, and he said, "Mom, you're the best trapper there ever was." He said, we found out who it was." And she said, "Who was it?" He said it was Henry Cuthke. He was the #1 deacon of the church. And she just laughed. She thought that was so funny. And every time she'd see him, she couldn't hardly look at him in the face, knowing what she had done to him. But she said that solved the cookie stealing. There was no more cookie stealing after that. So, so she just was a priceless lady that had a huge family, and she loved each one of us. And even though I spent more time with her than anybody, I still don't think I was her. I don't think she had a favorite grandchild. I think she loved all those grandkids just the same, always. I just happened to be around more than the rest of the kids did. But she had a heart of gold, and not having a grandpa, I can't ask for anything any better than to have a grandparent like she was. She was just priceless. And her kids were all good kids that would pitch right in and help you no matter what. Mother and Hazel got on a big Jag, I don't know, I had to be about 5 or 6. And they got into wallpapered. They wallpapered Grandma's house from stem to stern, just because they enjoyed doing it. They would take her down to the wallpaper store, and she'd pick out a piece that she liked. Maybe it was for the bathroom, maybe it was for the kitchen, maybe it was for the living room or the dining room or whatever, or a bedroom, and they'd come along and wallpaper it for her. And she just thought she's just the luckiest lady in the whole world, because she had these kids that just pitched right in and helped her all the time. The ones that were around that could help her. Some of them lived far enough away that they didn't get in on that part of it, but she was just priceless. Just priceless. And everybody that knew my grandpa said you would have just thought he was just the greatest thing since candy. Because he had a real jolly laugh and loved everybody, would help everybody, just like the building that house thing. And Mom said when they lived up Ochoco there, Grandpa had a rubber-tired wagon. And up here at the end of the dam is the big building there that was the Grange Hall. And they would hold dances in that. Well, occasionally they'd get the news out that they were having a dance. So Grandpa'd go out, and he would fill that wagon full of straw or hay, and everybody there at Grandma's, even the guys that were working at the mill that were staying there, they'd come out, get in the wagon, and he'd go down the road. Every house between where they lived and the Grange Hall, he'd stop. And everybody would just pile in that wagon. And down the road, and he'd sing all the way down there, and Mom said he'd sing all the way back and dance all night. And she said by the time they'd get home, it'd be starting to get daylight. And that was one of the big entertainment things that they did, was go to those dances and spend time with all their neighbors and friends. And she said he loved it. Just loved it. And anybody that I've talked to that had family along there that joined them just said it was just a blast. Not only for the kids, but for all the adults. They said that you just couldn't have more fun than he had with those horses and that wagon, and taking everybody to a dance. that was kind of Grandpa. He loved his job. He loved the timber. Grandma said she didn't know anybody that loved being in the timber more than Grandpa did. She said he just loved it. That was just his calling. And I wish so badly that he would have lived long enough for us kids. And Grandma would have said he'd have just spoiled us all rotten because he loved kids. And she said it wouldn't have made any difference whether it was girls or boys. He just loved all of us. She said he loved his family. And Mother had 5 sisters, and the 3 boys made up their family. And she said he was the best father you could ever ask. He took them fishing, take them out, and let the girls shoot the guns. And I have a gun that he bought my mother before she was married, and he'd give to her. And when she passed away, Jerry had it, and he gave it to me. And I'm going to pass it on to Carla's Nico, so he and his 3 kids can enjoy Grandma's 30-30. But the funny part of it was, one day I was sitting there at the house, and she said, is there anything that I've got that you'd really like to have? She was kind of on the downhill side of her health. And I said, well, Mom, I said, you know, when Dad died, the boys got all of his rifles. I would have liked to have had one of Dad's rifles. I didn't ever get to go hunting with him, but I would have liked to have had one of his rifles. And I said, the 30-30 that Grandpa bought you before you were married, I said, I'd like to have that. And she goes, oh, I knew this was going to happen. She turned her back to me, and I said, what do you mean? Well, she said, Jerry come along the other day, and he said, Mom, I'd like to have that 30-30 that Grandpa gave you. And she said, I give it to him. And I said, well, I said, okay, that's all right, as long as it's still in the family. I'm not going to throw a fit and have a big tizzy over the whole thing. I said, the boys got all Dad's rifles, and I just thought I would have liked to have had the one that you had. Okay, that wasn't good enough. After I left, she gets in the car, and she goes down to the sporting goods, and she buys 2 more 30-30s. So if Jerry's going to have the one that she had, she's going to give Jack and I each a 30-30, so we all got 30-30s. I thought, I don't want a brand new 30-30. I wanted the 30-30 Grandpa gave her. That was the purpose of the whole thing. So she didn't really figure that out before she died. But after she passed away and we were taking care of her, paying up her final stuff when she finally passed away, and we got her everything all settled, why Jerry come and brought me that 30-30, and he said, here, he said, you can have this. This is Mom's. And he said, I think you need that, so I have it. So, but my dad drove fuel truck for a long time. He drove for Shell Oil, and he drove for Union Oil, and he and my Uncle Ray, my mom's sister Hazel's husband, they had the appliance store down next to Joe Lindbergh's drugstore. That's what I was trying to think of a while ago. Right there on the corner of 3rd and Main. And from there we sold that store, and Uncle Ray went to Burns to manage the feed store in Burns, and we moved to Culver, and Dad bought the Culver Cash Grocery. Well, the ironic thing with that, And that store had a little butcher shop in it. So we had fresh meat, and we had a butcher that would come a couple of days a week and cut up the meat. And we had that for 4 years, and they would come every Friday from the butcher boys now used to be what was the name, Carla? I can't think. No, it was before that. The gal they've named the arena for, Yancey's, was Yancey's Meats up there. And they would bring us a half a slab of meat on Fridays. Well, it didn't take Jerry and I long to figure out if we had our clothes packed. They lived next door to Grandma, where the butcher boys' meat thing is. Down below is a big, tall white house. Mm-hmm. Well, the next place up the road towards Prineville was Grandma's place. We'd have our bags packed, and they'd haul us up to Grandma's house. We'd spend all weekend. Mom and Dad have to come get us on Saturday or Sunday, so we'd go back to school. We thought that was just more fun than whodunit. And Grandma was just thrilled to death because she was broken-hearted when we moved to Culver. So we got 4 days at home and 3 days with Grandma. So we had a lot of special times with Grandma, only because Grandpa wasn't there. But boy, I tell you what, she made up for what we missed with him. Because she'd go fishing with us, she'd go picnicking with us, and when they got settled over here quite a long time and moved down into Prineville from Grizzly, their family at Walterville, that was over in the Willamette Valley, they still had quite a bit of family. So they'd come up to Sisters and camp in a campground out of Sisters, and we'd go over and camp with them. And Grandma's brother, Ernie, fixed up a great big, he had a huge big deal that stove that he could cook on, have a fire, have a gas. It was gas, and he'd turn the gas on and be able to cook on it. But it stretched out like this, and then he made it go this way and that way, and he had lights with a generator strung up all over that we could see where we were going, and we just couldn't hardly wait for the time of year. And it was, everybody knew when it was a certain time of the summer month that we'd get together with the cousins from the other side of the mountain. And we did that for years. Just for years. We stayed really close to them. And as a kid growing up, I watched Prineville. Grandma and I, when I was just a little girl, I can remember the first time I really went to town with her. The streets were all dirt. There were no sidewalks. Town was pretty small. And then to watch it grow, took a long time for the streets to get paved.
How old were you when they paved the street?
Oh, probably 6 or 7, I think, when they come by our house there on 2nd Street and paved that street. I was in school. I was in probably about the 3rd grade. Man, we thought that was cool. We thought that was so cool. We had a paved street in front of our house. Mom was thrilled to death because she didn't have the dirt and the dust, because it was just gravel. And of course, from where we lived on 2nd Street, you just went straight up the street and you were at the high school. Mm-hmm. Jerry and I, and we went to school at Crooked River, which that was just a block over from our house. We always walked home for lunch. And when we got into high school, we would walk from home up to the high school. About a block before you got to the high school, the Hudspeths had pretty much a block taken up of their homes. Fred and Claude and Grandpa and Grandma Hudspeth. And some of their backyards and swimming pools come out to the edge of the pavement there. But Grandma Hudspeth had a rocking chair. She had a great big window in her living room. I don't care what time of the morning you went to school. If you had to go at 6 o'clock, I didn't ever go that early, but I guarantee you she probably was sitting in that chair. Because when you went by her house between 7:30 and 8 o'clock, she's sitting right there in that window waving at you. Well, we'd come home for lunch. She'd be sitting right there. She'd be waving at us. We'd go back to school. She'd be sitting right there and she'd wave at us. That went on our whole 4 years of going to high school. That woman sat in that rocking chair and waved at us every single day. It was just something that she enjoyed. Once in a while, and the Fred and his wife on the other side of the street had gorgeous roses planted in a big planter that went separated their house and their driveway inside from the street. And just gorgeous, gorgeous big roses. And one day I went up the street and there was one of them that was just hanging down, way down, almost touching the pavement. And I went over and broke it off, and Grandma was sitting there in the window, and I walked over there and I held it up so she could see it. And she just got the biggest smile on her face. So I went over and knocked on the door, and she got up and come to me, and I said, Grandma, this rose is just special for you, and it was trying to get to you, but it couldn't get across the street, so I had to help it. And she just thought that was just great. So that when I come home from school that day, she had it sitting in a vase about that tall on a little table right there in front of that window. So I'd see that she was taking care of that rose. But what fond memories. And then my brother and a boy from Paulina, Carl Weaver, was a year ahead of Jerry in school. And he wanted to play football and he wanted to play basketball. But it was too far for him to drive back and forth, every night to practice and then drive home and all that. So he come and asked Mom and Dad if he could stay with us. He said, I'll even pay you. And Dad said, no. He said, no, I don't want you to pay me. He said, you can stay with us. He said, Jerry's got an extra bed up there in his bedroom. So he lived with us for 3 years. So I had 2 big brothers and a little bitty brother. And the boys played football, and the whole time they played football, it was at the fairgrounds, in the arena, in the dirt, in the cow manure and the horse manure. That's where they played football. Yeah. And I ended up, and I started driving school bus. Were you guys in school yet, Carla?
Yeah.
And I took the girls on my route every day, and my route was clear out Madras Highway, the farthest route out, and around by underneath Grizzly there, and come out and come down.
Ryegrass and Grimes.
Yeah, Ryegrass and Grimes, and come clear over on Gerke and drop down on Lamonta, and come in down there and come into Ochoco School, and then all the way up and on into the junior high and the high school, the whole 9 yards. I drove for 10 years. I whether I want to tell you this or not. The first day that I went up there to drive bus, John Ferguson was the bus guy, and his dad was the mechanic in there that mechanicked on the buses, but John was kind of in charge of the buses and stuff. He was a senior when I was a freshman. And he said, well, Betty, he said, this is going to be your first run. He said, I don't know whether I want to tell you this or not. And I'm trying to think, what's he fidgeting around trying to tell me here that he's not coming out with? And I looked at him and I said, well, am I ready to go? And he said, no, you're not. He said, I got to tell you, this route that I'm putting you on to start with is out there in Crestview, which is right down underneath the grade when you're going up the grade, like going to Redmond, the little housing development down there in the bottom. And he said, when you get down the end of that straight stretch where you drive in there, there's a bus stop there that there's 19 kids. And I thought, well, okay. And he said, I got to tell you, there's a boy on there that has run off 4 bus drivers already. And I'm going, whew. And he said, I'm one of them. I looked at him and I thought, what's wrong with you? That you let him run you off. And so he told me, he said, I got to warn you. He said, you will have trouble. He is brutal. And he said, you are going to have trouble with him. And if you kick him off, it's okay. I wasn't right sure I wanted to drive bus then. I kind of wanted to just go get in my car and go home. But I thought, I can't imagine how this could happen, and this kid's still on the bus route. So I said, okay, I'll do my best, John. And he said, just come back and let me know how it went. I said, okay. So I get out there, and I have to make a stop before I get to that big bus stop. And there's 2 kids get on there. And they got on and went kind of to the back of the bus. And I pull up to the big bus stop, and I open the door. And there's 2 boys get on, and they sit right behind me. And there's 2 girls that get on, and they sit right across from me. And then from then, it's just, who gets on and wherever they sit. And I'm greeting them all, good morning and all this. And I thought, got it ready to shut the door, and I thought, that kid must not be on here. I didn't see anybody that was any kind of problem, but I haven't got very far yet either, so I guess I couldn't get too excited about the whole thing. So I get out and I get on the road and I go over to Ochoco grade school and dump off the kids over there, come out of there, come up the street, go up to the junior high school, dump those kids off, and I get to the high school and I dump everybody off. I get back down to the bus shop, and of course John's just standing right there waiting for me to get there to see what's happened. And he goes, well, so what happened? I said, he must not have rode today. Oh, he said, if he'd have been on there, you'd have known it. And I said, I didn't find anybody that was any problem whatsoever on that bus. Well, he said, you lucked out. He said, he must not have been on there at all. So I thought, whew. I get up there and I pick them all up, take them home, and next morning I get ready to go, and John's standing there and he goes, well, all I can tell you is good luck, because sometime this week you're going to have him somewhere along the line. It's going to happen. And I said, well, I hope not, but if so, I'll deal with it as best I can, and if I can't, why, then we'll do something different. He said, okay, that's all I can ask, he said. So I go down there. I do the same thing I did the other day. Drive in, pick up those 19 kids, and the same situation. They all get on about the same and sit in about the same seats where they all sat to start with. And these two boys are sitting behind me, and there's two girls sitting across the aisle from me. And I thought, gosh dang, I can't figure out who they're talking about, who this kid is. Well, this went on for 3 days. And finally, one morning, and the whole thing played out just like it had all week long. And I said, they got up to the high school, and there was 2 high school girls I knew that were the last 2 getting off. And I said, I need to ask you a question. And I said, was so-and-so on here today? Yeah. I said, have they been on here all week? Yeah. I said, really? Where are they sitting? Well, they're sitting right behind you. And you're visiting with them. I go, really? I couldn't wait to get back to the bus shop. I just went whizzing along and got all those kids off. And so John's waiting there at the bus shop for me, and he goes, so, had to be on there today. And I looked at him, I said, yeah. I said, he was on there today. Well, did you have any trouble? No. And I said, you want to hear the rest of the story? He's been there on there all week. Sat right behind me all the way to school, every day, in the same seat, right behind me. I have not had 1 ounce of problem out of him. And Josh he just looked like I'd slapped him in the face, and he goes, I can't believe that. He said, he didn't even get smart with you? I said, no. What did you talk about? I said, well, the first day those boys got on, and the bus was loading, and I turned around and I said, are you boys playing any sports this year? Yep, we're going out for wrestling. And I said, well, I can talk wrestling. I said, I got a brother that wrestles, and I said, I've hauled the wrestlers around a little bit. And I said, that's what we've been talking about, is wrestling. Okay. So then I drive that route pretty near all year, and then they switched me into one of the big buses that was 73 passenger bus, and I went clear out to Grizzly and all the way around. And that was my bus run, my real bus run that I had all the time. And of course he wasn't on that bus run. And so I run into his sister one time down in Thriftway, and she cornered me and she said, you know, and she'd been riding the bus. She said, I was telling my mom, since Lonnie's been riding your bus, he's just a different kid. He's not belligerent, and he's not ornery, and he's not trying to cause a fight and all that stuff. And she said, it's just, she said, he's just kind of a different kid. And I said, I told her, I said, Barbara, I said, I don't know, I haven't done anything different, I just visited with him. Well, he graduated from high school, and he went up around someplace up just over the border in Washington, and he was doing carpenter work. And I picked the paper up one day, and here in the paper, he'd been killed in a car accident. And it was about probably not quite a month, I run into her again. And of course she was just crying to beat the band when she saw me. And I stood there and talked to her, and she said, I got to tell you, she said, now that he's gone, she said, and she said, like I told you before, it made a change in him. And she said, one night at the table, he was sitting there at the table and he was eating his supper. And he said, all us kids were sitting there and Mom was sitting there with us. And he said, you know, and this wasn't too long before he graduated. He said, I just love that bus driver I got. She is just the nicest person I think I've ever been around. She said, I just wanted you to know that. She said, now that he's gone, she said, so you can remember he was a good kid. And I said, as far as I knew, he was a great kid. I didn't see the ugly side of him. I heard it, but I did never see it. And she said, my mom said, if there's anything that she could ever do, she hoped that she could see him again. Someday, that she could walk up and put her arms around him, and he would say, Mom, I love you. And I looked at Barbara and I said, if he could tell your mother that he loved me, you know darn good and well he loved your mother. And you go home and tell her that. I said, he wouldn't have said that about me if he hadn't felt that about your mom. And so, just one of those things. I don't know, like I said, I didn't do anything out of this world different. It was, and I drove bus 10 years. I drove the track team, the girls' track team, when they were #1 in the state. I drove them all over the place. And I drove the wrestlers down to Watonka. I drove the football boys down to Forest Grove. I drove the track girls back up to Nissa for district. And I've just had a colorful life. Both of my girls were very active in track. And I followed them as much as I could follow them. Of course, at that time I was still driving school bus, so I kind of had to. And I was working 2 jobs, driving school bus, and I was working at the flower shop. So I kept up with them. They got into rodeoing in the summertime, and I took them all over Oregon to rodeo. And one year they decided they wanted to go up into Idaho and rodeo. Well, Carla was working at the mill, and I don't know what Bob was doing, but I said, well, you girls are going to have to go up and then turn around and go back home, and I'll take the horse or 2 horses in the trailer and go from rodeo to rodeo up through Idaho, because I'm not going to turn around and haul these horses home and then have to turn right around and bring them back. I said, that's just not going to fly. And so that was fine and dandy with them. So the first night I left, we were at Ailment, and I left with 1 horse, and I thought, well, I'll get someplace where I can find a pull-out that's maybe got people in it, or a little park alongside the road that somebody'd be there. I didn't want to just be there by myself, and I didn't have any way of locking that dressing room of that trailer or anything. So I pulled in there, and I got the horse out, watered it. We were along the Little Salmon River, and I kind of got things organized in the trailer, and pretty soon it began to get dusk, and I thought, well, I'll just get him ready, give him 1 more drink, and I'll get ready and go to bed. And there'd been a camper pulled in there, and I thought, well, there's people staying here. that camper's in here. And I'll be safe. Nobody will get me. And I didn't have anything that I thought I could protect myself with other than a stock prod for cows that's got batteries, and you shock somebody with it pretty good. So I put that alongside my bed, and I got in, crawled in bed. I laid there. Well, pretty soon the camper pulls out. Now I know I'm the only one there. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to sleep with one eye open because I just knew somebody's going to pull in there and come see what's in that trailer. And about an hour later, a little car pulls in about as far away as from here to that rocking chair. And he gets out and he opens the back of that trailer or that car, and he pulls out some plastic, which really got my attention. And he took it and laid it down in front of his car, stretched it all out, laid it down. And pretty soon he gets in there, he's got a big sleeping bag, and he packs that around there, and he puts it down, lays it down. And I'm thinking, gosh. And the light's on with his, when he put that thing up, it had a light, so I could see what he was doing. So he gets into his cooler, and he's sitting there eating a banana. And I'm thinking, gosh, guy, go to bed. I'm tired of sitting here, propped up here, seeing what you're doing. Pretty soon he shut down that. He crawled in his bed. Of course, I slept with one eye open because I just knew a lone person was going to come over and see what was in that trailer. So the next morning, I got up just at the very crack of dawn. And I opened the door of the trailer, got out, and I was dressed. Got a hold of him, took him down, watered him right good. Come back, and I opened up the back of the trailer. It kind of squawked a little bit, but not bad. It had a wooden floor, and that horse stepped in that floor, and it went clomp, 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 like that. And that guy had to just scare the crap out of him. He was laying there in that sleeping bag, and he just went whoop like this, and he sat up and he just looked around. And I said, good morning. I said, we're just getting ready to pull out of here. I'm sorry I woke you up. Oh, he said, that's fine. He just covered his head back up and laid back down, went back to sleep. And I got that pickup, and up the road I went, just as fast as I could go. And I got clear to Grangeville, and the fairgrounds was all locked up, so I couldn't get in there to put the horse in a corral. And some people that lived right there across the street from the fairgrounds, he was a board member and a director. So they come over to visit with me, and they wanted me to come stay at their house and just put the horse in a corral there in the fairgrounds. Well, you never know whether kids are going to come along and open the corral and turn them loose or whatever, and I just didn't feel safe enough to turn him loose and not knowing what that horse, where he was going to be or what that was going to happen. So I told him, no, I thought I would stay there, but I would keep in touch with him. You talk about the nicest people. They took me on a picnic up in the mountains with them with some more friends they had. They'd come over and saw me every day and would bring me something. She'd bake something and she'd bring it over to me. I went over there and had supper with them one night. I just had a wonderful time in Grangeville with them. And when the kids come up to rodeo, one of the boys that had been one of my adopted kids that kind of clumb on to me, wanted, and I was headed to Pendleton. And he said, where are you going to stay when you get down there? And I said, oh, I don't know, probably out at the fairgrounds. No, he said, you're not. You come to our house. We got a corral, and we can put the horse in the corral. And my mother said, you're going to stay with us. So when I got down there, she had a bed, spare bed, and she had it all made, and they just treated me like I was a queen. So my traveling with the kids and and everywhere I went, it was just like you were a piece of sticky glue or something, because kids would just stick to you. And boys especially. One night at Hermiston, I put 25 kids to bed in sleeping bags underneath my gooseneck trailer. And they were mainly boys. And the girls, and I give them a speech when this all started, and I said, no hanky-panky going on here. I said, these girls are my girls, and they can be your sisters. And every one of them just loved them to death. They'd go out and play football in the arena, or they'd go play baseball, and the girls would go out there and play with them. And they were just like having a whole bunch of kids. I felt just like the old mother in the shoe, you know. It's just what I felt like. I had so many kids, I didn't know what to do with all of them. And I still have several of those kids still call me. They just adopted me as their second mother, and call me on Christmas or Thanksgiving or Mother's Day or birthday or whatever. A boy that worked over here at Schwab for a long time, he told his wife, he said, I sure wish I could have had some say-so before I was born, because he said, I sure wish she'd have been my mother. So I've had a very fun life. My family's a pretty happy family. Very well known. And like I said, with Grandpa having 11 brothers and sisters and Grandma having 8 brothers and sisters, when they all started exploding, look what happened. I can come to town and run into at least 2 cousins every time I get into town. So, and it's like the well driller, he called me up one day and he goes, I just can't believe everybody I talk to knows you. He said, I can't quite understand that. I said, Ed, just stop and think how many people I'm related to. He said, well, you're related to everybody. Everybody knows you. And I said, well, I come from a big family. And I said, at one point in time, way back, when Prineville was very small, we were related to everybody in town. Yeah. And you knew everybody in town. Grandma knew everybody in town when she come to town. She taught Sunday school at the First Baptist Church for the 5-year-old kids for 35 years. And I helped her through a lot of that, and about the time I was 24, she finally said I could graduate out of the 5-year-old class. So she quit and I quit too. Mother and Dad were involved in the Eastern Star, and I was involved in Job's Daughters. Mm-hmm. And so there you're connected with a whole bunch more people. That the class of 57, when they graduated, I took their first picture, their reunion picture after they graduated the next year. I've taken every one of them since then. And I told them last year, I said, I'm going to tell you guys something. I think I'm as involved in this class as everybody else is, or a little bit more, so I think I need a diploma saying I graduated in 1957, and this is what you get, a picture. And there's one girl that's got all the pictures that I've taken. So I've had a pretty rounded life.